I'm glad we got together today. We got some
Yeah,
interesting stuff to talk about.
excellent. So,
Had a little bit of I went to SQL Bits, which was an awesome conference over in Wales. Great, great audience.
right.
Definitely a premier data conference. Got a little flu or cold on the way back, so had a cough. I might sound like James Earl Jones today. This is PBIDC.
That's right. Um, well, good. So this is a great topic. I'm excited about you presenting this. Um, and yeah, so it's going to be one of those conversations we talk about the whole embedding side of things is really interesting because from my perspective on the side where I've worked in the dynamics, I see a lot of customers that want to be able to take the data they have about their customers, as they're serving those customers, be able to present some of that data to their customers, or other organizations need to present it internally within an app. And there's this, the whole concept of app owns data and user owns data. Um, I gotta confess, I sometimes I get those backwards. So I'm looking forward to you being able to show it off and kind of give us an understanding of what's going on here.
Yeah, I've done a lot of sessions, over the last couple of years. What is this, session number 32? But many of those sessions, more than any other topic, have been dedicated to Power BI embedding. So what I wanted to do is just kind of put together kind of the best practices and guidance. Some of this will be, let's get to a slide and then point you to a different slide deck.
Sure.
We're not going to be able to drill down in all topics, but what I've seen is a lot of repeating patterns that customers keep coming up with to solve different problems in various ways. So we got a pretty good session here. We should
Perfect,
just go
man.
ahead and maybe start this up. Let's go ahead and get this silly face off there, and then now what we're going to talk about, as we go through this is, well, I guess first of all, I should say welcome everyone to Power BI Dev Camp, and don't forget about our Power BI Dev Camp portal. And if I, go to our Dev Camp portal here, you can see you can find all the different sessions. And what I try to do is, have the convenient links to things like the slide decks and the sample applications. And, if you go to the past and look at one of these, it will also just link you right into the, 60-minute session that we have on YouTube in the Power BI YouTube channel. Okay, so with that, let's get back here, into the slides. And there's also going to be two different code samples that I've built. One is called the App Owns Data Starter Kit. And that kind of, provides a starter point, to give you guidance. And then what I did last fall is I kind of created a specialized version of it. The first one uses Azure AD, just regular Azure AD to authenticate users. But if we really want broader reach with a Microsoft authentication layer, Azure AD B2C is a better choice. So there's two repositories. And then the one thing I wanted to point out is there's two, but the first one is where all the documentation is. I didn't duplicate the documentation. It's just some different code inside there. Okay, so here's the topics we're going to look at, Scott. It's a pretty aggressive list of things to go through. And I think, you hit the nail right on the head when you said, I'm not really sure whether to pick user owns data or app owns data. And what we see is that you can't make any other real design choice until you decide between these two. Sometimes we talk to customers and we get 45 minutes into the meeting and they say, can we do this? And I still say, you haven't committed to user owns data versus app owns data. Once you commit to that, I can tell you what you can do. So we're going to spend the first part just kind of drilling down on that. And then there's various other topics that we're going to go into. Now, the very first time when I kind of created a slide deck on Power BI Embedding, I put together this animation, and I like it enough where I kind of keep using it. So let's say that you're the application developer. You're creating a browser-based application, and let's kind of keep it generic. Your application might be a single-page application that runs entirely in the browser. Maybe you have a backend with .NET or Node.js or Java or Salesforce or whatever backend platform you want. And at some point, you're going to have to talk to Azure AD to get an access token such that you can call to the Power BI service and the Power BI service API. Now, the way it works is that you'll get some type of a access token, so you can call to the Power BI REST API. You're going to get embedding data, send that back to the client tier, and you're also going to provide a security token. Security token is kind of a generic term because there's two types, and we'll drill down on that. But the idea is that once you get all this back to the browser, the final step is you writing some JavaScript code or TypeScript code against a JavaScript API that we have that behind the scenes creates an iframe and basically, creates a session right between that iframe and the Power BI service. So your application sets up the dance, but it's not part of the dance once it starts. And what's kind of neat about this is now the user can click on slicers and navigate between pages. And, there's really not a lot of difference between how, the report works once it loads, whether it's in an embedded scenario or whether a user's just looking at it, right through the Power BI service. Now, once again, let's kind of differentiate between these two very important, development models. There's user owns data embedding, what we would call the software as a service or SaaS approach, also known as embed. Oh my gosh, Scott, I have an error here. This is embed for your organization. When typos reach a certain point, you just have to stop the slide deck. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is embed for your organization. And the thing to note here is that when we pass a security token, back to the browser, it's an Azure AD token with that user's identity inside of it. Now, when we move over to app owns data embedding and embed for your customers, we don't pass back an Azure AD token. The developer creates something which is called a Power BI embed token, and that very much changes the dynamics of, what's possible and how you do your programming. Now, just to kind of go down this big list right here, Scott, I think this is something where, there's the AKA, so user owns data, also known as embed for your organization, app owns data, also known as embed for your customers. And, second, realize, one is really a SaaS model, where users have licenses and, each user license is paying for the Power BI usage, as opposed to a PaaS model, where we just kind of buy memory and processing cycles, and there's no kind of per user licensing. As far as what is the sweet spot, for these models, user owns data. If you have a big organization, 5,000 users, and instead of going to the Power BI portal, everyone wants to see reports, in some other context, whether it's going to be, some custom widget we put into Salesforce or our own custom portal. For the app owns data model, typically it's an independent software vendor or, some large organization that's trying to reach, as many users as possible. Now, when it comes down to, do we use this for multi-tenant applications? Generally, we don't do that, in user owns data. When we have multi-tenant, designs that we're going to look at extensively, that happens in an app owns data. Now, when it comes to identity provider, when we use app owns data, we have one choice: Azure AD work and school accounts. And either you have to be in my tenant or you have to be in another tenant that my IT staff, is obliged to kind of invite in and integrate into the mix. When we look over on the other side, what type of account, do you have to have for app owns data? And the answer is anyone that you want. So when we use app owns data, quite often, the intention is we want broad reach. I want to reach that user and take that user's money, even if he doesn't have a work or school account. He might want to use LinkedIn or Facebook, or maybe I have my own custom hand-rolled authentication layer. So what's kind of nice is that you get, a lot of freedom there, but freedom comes with some trade-offs. So let's look at permissions. When you use user owns data, the way you configure permissions for the user is the exact same way you configure permissions for that user if they were going to app.powerbi.com and consuming the content. So basically Power BI maintains the access control lists. With user owns data, it's very, very different, because, and let me see if I can get my pen in line here. Permissions are managed by the developer. Now that makes app owns data, I'm going to just come out and say something like 3 to 5 times more expensive to get an app out the door, because you're authenticating the user. And then, people keep asking me, well, how do I authenticate the user? What do I use? Well, look in the mirror. You are the one who is going to, create a database to hold your permissions, and you're going to have code that's going to, implement a custom authorization scheme. Now, let's look at this next line down here. And that is, can you prevent the user from going to the Power BI service? So if you own, if you're using user owns data and you want the user to go to your app, you have to give users permissions where they can also go to app.powerbi.com and see the same report. How can you stop that? You can't, other than keeping the user in the dark, so they never find out, what URL to go to. So if you need, full control, over your security model, you have to use the app owns data model. As we keep going down here, Power BI REST API calls. Well, on the first model, it's under the identity and permissions of the current user. On the app owns data model, it's, calls are executed as a service principal that generally can see everything. And the big difference is that the developer, runs code as a service principal that can see everything, but then the developer has to reach into the database, figure out what is this user able to see. And when you create the embed token, you are creating, gospel as far as what that user can do, because into that embed token is where you're going to put things like report IDs and dataset IDs. A couple other things, if you want to deploy your code entirely as a single page application, you can do that with user owns data. For things like Salesforce, we can create kind of neat little SPA widgets just to put on a page. But when it comes to app owns data, you got to have server-side code. There's no way that you could, maintain the levels of security that you need, trying to call as a service principal, from the browser. And then finally, one requires a dedicated capacity, app owns data. There's no user licensing. That's one of the benefits, but then you always have to be paying for a dedicated capacity. And some people go to user owns data because they don't have to spend so many thousand a month. They can try to get by, with pro licenses. But once again, what we see is that most people that are serious, about Power BI embedding, are over on the right side using app owns data. So really, that's going to kind of be the focus of what we're going to, be looking at. Now, one of the things that we start, seeing is that our customers want to create a multi-tenant environment. And so they have many different customers. And for each customer, they want a set of reports and maybe one or more data sets. So we have this idea of creating a customer tenant, which is kind of the customer footprint. The best practice in Power BI is to start separating your customer tenants, by creating a separate workspace for each one, and then also separating the data, for each of your customer tenants into different data sets. And the one thing we have to call out is people use the term Azure AD tenant, and that's completely different than how we're using the term tenant here. Just think of tenant as the footprint of content for one customer, and things like data set credentials, to get to the data set. We need to isolate those. And so one of the things that, often a development team needs to figure out is, I can create one of these tenants by hand, but we really need to be able to write code so we can quickly, and reliably, provision, workspace after workspace and fill it with content, for our different customer tenants. Now, if you look at the app owns data starter kit, it's going to provide guidance for these areas, onboarding new customer tenants, managing user permissions. It's also going to, show a design where you can have a single page application that then talks to a backend custom web API. And then finally, at the end, we're going to talk about, creating a custom telemetry layer. One of the things, that is at first, hard to do with app owns data is to monitor usage, because when you look into the Power BI activity log and say, who opened that report, it will say service principal, not John Doe. So we need to kind of add a custom layer, to start adding, usage data. Once you figure out how to do, it's very powerful. And actually you get a lot better usage data than you get from the Power BI built-in activity logs. Okay, now with the App Owns Data Starter Kit, what we have is an admin application that talks to a API. It creates workspaces, uploads things, but we're always going to take information about the inventory of our assets and we're going to add them, into a database. And we need that database for permissions. And so then when we want to get the, ultimate end users into the system, we have this API. And, over the years, I created, first of all, a simple HTML JavaScript client. And then I had another session at the end of last summer, where I kind of had a more real world client built with React JS. Okay, so that's going to be what the architecture is going to look like. Now, also, we have a database schema, to get up and going. And I'll be the first to say that this database schema is probably going to be more simple and you'll have to extend it, for the security needs, of your system. But the idea is that every time we create a new workspace, we'll create a row in the tenants table to track that. Each time we have a user, it will have a row in the users table and it will point to one specific tenant. And then we'll have an activity log. But things that we see, as customers extending this because they want to have a user be, able to be a member of 2 or 3 tenants, not just one. So it would just be, adding a bridge table in between tenants and users, for user to tenant permissions. If you wanted to, not have security at the workspace level, but to have it at the report level, once again, it would just be adding more tables. Now, as we end this kind of first section right here, there's a lot of content that I'm not going to be able to drill down to. And I just kind of wanted to point out that the very first session I did on the starter kit, was 2 years ago, session 11. Last summer, we added a bunch more content, and there's a lot of content as far as creating the front end with React. And we're going to see that in the demo coming up, but hopefully people are able to kind of leverage this code and use it as a starting point. Now, if we keep going here, which identity providers, are you going to use? The ones that I did out of the box, first I did Azure AD because it's simple to get a demo up and running, but it's not real world for App Owns Data Embedding because generally you want an identity provider with better reach, especially to consumers. So I did a second session showing Azure AAD B2C, and that's what I'm going to be using in my demo. But note that with App Owns Data, you can plug in any identity provider that you want. Sometimes you can choose, other times, you're told that you have to use, one login, ping, Okta, Auth0. So there's lots of different identity providers. And at the end of the day, the developer has to authenticate the user. And after authentication is done, there's this one basic fact, and that's the user ID, whether it's a UPN or an email address, and then kind of all our permissions in the database, revolve around that. Now, if you want to kind of see some, low-level stuff with working with Azure AD B2C, we do have a session from last October. But let's do this. Let's go over to here, and I'm going to go to this one user. And, we have our user, Austin Powers here, and he's going to go to this React client. And so once he gets to the React client, he's going to log in. And so, what you see here is that if this user just has an email address and no social media accounts anywhere or no real accounts, they can just put in an email and password, and Azure AD B2C will create a local account for them. If they want to use a Microsoft personal account, a work and school account, and just by configuration, you can hook in other things. So let's say for here, we'll use the work and school account. So this will, basically bring up something where this user is now able to, change things such as, what his, display name would be in terms of our system. Okay. And so, now that, this user has been added, this user now is going to be able to have access. If you look at that one session, I also kind of show how you can set things up, so that Azure AD B2C kind of has some, like an event handler when a new user is added, that we can go ahead and forward them and, welcome them in. Now, back here in the session, let's now kind of go through, the multi-tenant provisioning patterns. So we have this app owns data admin program, and it's going to call into the Power BI REST API, and it's going to do things like create a workspace and upload a PBIX file. Now, let's say that we go back here. And so now I'm going to be a administrator. So as a administrator right here, let's say that we we want to create a new customer tenant, and we'll call this dev camp, and we'll go ahead and choose OK. And so right now, the code is going through this provisioning process of creating a workspace, adding it to a dedicated capacity, uploading a PBIX file. So at this point, we've created, something new here. If I go back here into Power BI and I kind of look at it, note that I have a little trick here that when I kind of create the caption, as you'll see it in the Power BI UI, I just put AOD for App Owns Data Starter Kit, so I know that that's the one. But as I open this up, and now we kind of go down and we drill down on the data set, what you can see is that this data set, is not created and managed by a human. It was created and managed, either by a service principal or a service principal profile. What is a service principal profile, you ask, Scott? Stay tuned. Okay, let's keep going through here. Now, what you kind of saw there is that, when we create this new particular workspace, it just kind of ran the code, to go through here and, create a new Power BI workspace, assign a dedicated capacity. And then there's also the business of importing a PBIX file, as a template. But every single customer tenant isn't going to point to the same database. So what we need is we have some way to kind of update dataset parameters and patch the data source credentials. Now, if you got to look at this sample, for instance, if I go back to the sample, which you can download and use in Visual Studio, and then we kind of drill inside here, you can see that there is a PBIX file. And, with that PBIX file, what we've done is, in the Power Query level, we've created these two query parameters or dataset parameters, database server and database name. And then as we create queries, we never hard code a path. Instead, we use these parameters. And that gives us kind of the convenience, to be able to upload and then run code that looks like this. The idea is that we'll upload the data set, via the PBIX file, and then we'll make API calls to say, I want to switch out the database server and the database name, with the values appropriate for this customer. Now we kind of go through the dance of updating the data source credentials and running a refresh operation. But being able to kind of do that type of provisioning, gets to be, pretty important. Now, next thing we're going to look at is service principal profiles. But let's kind of start with a little background on why you have to care. Now, in Power BI, we have this limitation that's documented saying a user or a service principal can be, at most a member of 1,000 workspaces. Once we add a user, or a service principal to 1,001 workspaces, you've now kind of slid into this unsupported territory. So a couple things. First of all, the purpose of this limitation is to maintain high levels of performance. So as you add a service principal to more and more workspaces, things slow down, not terribly, but a little bit. And, the answer, of why this is has to do with the fact that behind the scenes, Power BI maintains an access control list for this user. So think of it that you're coming in through the front door and some guard has a list of what you can see. And if you say, I want to see this workspace, and you hand, the guard a GUID, and that guard has a list of one GUID and compares it, hey, great. What would happen if you say, here's my GUID, and that guard has a list of 1,000 GUIDs that they have to look through and match it up? So the idea is it takes a lot longer. And, some observations is that, once you get over 1,000, it doesn't really kill your performance, as opposed to how it was just before. Performance wise, whether you're 999 or 1001, there's no difference other than Microsoft can say you're in unsupported territory. But, what we like is to have as few as possible. So if we have to look through a smaller list, obviously being a member of 100 workspaces would be better than 1,000. Being a member of 10 would be better than 100. And what's the best number? 1. Is it critical for all applications? I'd say no. But it does improve performance, especially when, scaling, and having, hundreds of client requests, within the span of a minute. Those are the kind of places where this really matters. Okay. Now, the second reason we have to care about service principal profiles has to do with data isolation. Now, what we'd like in a multi-tenant environment is we'd like everything from customer one, the data in their database and the credentials to get to their database to be completely isolated, from all the other customer tenants. But here's how you get into trouble. So each data set is owned by a single owner, which is either a user, a service principal, or a service principal profile. And what's not obvious is that the scope, of that user and that user's credentials, go across all workspaces. So here's a scenario where people get bit. And that is, let's say we have a multi-tenant environment and we have one database and we connect to that database, the same connection string, but we have different users for all our customer tenants. So for customer tenant 1, we use user 1 and this password. When we go to 2, and then, in SQL, you can kind of set up per user permissions. Well, here's the issue. If you have one service principal, you go set the user password for tenant 1. But then when you do it for tenant 2, you're effectively overwriting, the data set credentials for data set 1 because they have the exact same connect string. So going to separate service principals, is one way to kind of get that isolation. Now, what is a service principal profile? A service principal profile, are things that allow you to kind of create a local account in the Power BI service authorization system. Now, if instead of creating service principal profiles, you create a new Azure AD application, and therefore you get a separate service principal for each of your customer tenants, that's another solution. The problem is sometimes the IT shop tells you to pound sand when you ask them for more than one Azure AD application. And also creating these in real time gets to be hard. So the idea of a service principal profile is the Power BI team said, can we just kind of create local identities? One, so that, the access control lists can be kind of kept real low, because one service principal, I have the IT department create one Azure AD app. I run as one service principal, but now the service principal can create profiles. And the profile becomes a first class, security entity as far as Power BI is concerned. Now, one thing to note, service principal profiles are completely known to Power BI, but completely unknown to Azure AD. So you can't take a service principal profile and add it to an Azure Directory security group. You can't call into Azure SQL under the identity of a service principal profile. So there'll be some cases where service principal profiles, aren't as good as individual service principals, but in many scenarios, they are going to be good. So once again, the service principal profile becomes a first class thing that can be the owner and can be added as a member. Okay, so once again, you can have a service principal profile added as a workspace member. And then the other thing is the service principal can create a profile, and right after that, it can start executing calls under that profile's identity. So service principal creates profile 1 and then uses profile 1 to make calls to create the workspace, create the data set, and profile 1 is automatically the owner. In fact, if profile 1 has permissions to see that particular workspace, it doesn't automatically mean the service principal has access to see it. So they're kind of seen as different entities. And one of the nice things is that if you then kind of do this work to, the way I like to think of it, Scott, as a consultant, when times are slow, you got to go to the customer site. When times are good, you can hire 5 contractors and have them go do all the work and you can collect the money. So it's a little bit like that, in the fact that you create a profile and then anytime you read or write, to that tenant, you have to execute calls, under that profile's identity. But it gives you, a great way to make sure that when you call in, the caller is only a member of a single workspace and you get complete isolation, because you don't have the same owner of any data source credentials, across workspaces.
Yeah, that isolation aspect and the aspect of being able to like really partition out the data, so important in so many cases where we see like ISVs or organizations with pretty partition sensitive data. So this approach is really great to be able to create that isolation and be comfortable that there's not an accidental sharing going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so if you look at the the 2 samples, the AppOwn's Data Starter Kit, with and without the Azure B2C, both now have been programmed to use service principal profiles to kind of show you the basic usage, of them. And, there is the AppOwn's Data Admin. That's the one that kind of creates the content and that uses service principal profiles. But then the web API, since it's consuming, has to do the same thing. So basically there has to be some coordination where a specific service principal profile, creates content. It probably is going to be the only one with permissions to go back, and read that as well. Now, this topic gets pretty deep. There is a drill down session 20, that you can see, and it goes a little bit more into the weeds about working and the programming with service principal profiles. Okay, so now what we want to do is let's move ahead and just kind of talk about permission management. And so what we'd like to do is we'd like to manage permissions. And so let's kind of start by, and I'm going to be 2 users. The first user I'm going to be, is the one that, is an admin in the hosting company, that's offering customers the SaaS service with Power BI embedding. So I created this dev camp. And, inside of this admin application, I can do things like, view and see what's inside there. What are the data sets? What are the reports? Who are the users inside there? I can also see users. So we got this one user, Austin. And, I am here in another browser. And so what we'll do here is let's take Austin and the way I have things set up in this demo is when you come in, I automatically let you see some content in a read-only basis. But maybe in a more realistic scenario, when you first come into the system, you are unassigned. So let's go back and kind of see, the experience of this user, when they come to this portal and, you can see here that user kind of has not been assigned a tenant. You have no access to any reports. Okay, so now we're going to kind of move through this process here of the administrator can say, okay, well, let's go ahead and give that, user access, to this particular tenant. We'll go ahead and save those permissions. And once again, now we'll go back and we'll do a quick refresh. And so we're not going to give this user, any read-write capabilities yet. You can see that the user can edit content, user can create content, both are false. But this user now has been given access to, here is a Power BI report. And, here's just a kind of quick look at what I covered when I covered the React client side work. So create a menuing system where we let the user export, a single page of the whole report. We let the user do things, like add or remove the navigation that's built in, or add or remove the filter pane or bookmarks. So we can kind of build a lot into the client experience. Now this user can only view, but what we might also do is back here, if I go back to this user And now we decide that we want to give this user edit permissions. And once again, what's really happening here? I click OK. I've updated a record in a database. And so what happens over here is that this client calls the back-end web API, and it's going to pass a view model. I'm not sure about you, Scott, but I am in love with Fiddler. I'm pretty sure that you are not. But if I come back here and we now kind of see what am I really getting here? So here is an example of we call embed. If I kind of look at what is being passed inside here, here's kind of the view model that we're passing from the back end. So we need things like what are the reports, such that we can start building the menuing system here. There's other things such as who is the user. Here's some hints whether to light up the UI or not. But realize whether the user can create or edit is really enforced by the embed token. We're going to look a little bit more at the embed token, but you can't just say user can create true or false, because that would be easy to overcome in the browser. But once again, we'll see it's the embed token, that really kind of states whether the user is allowed to go into edit mode and write changes back. But once this user is in edit mode, what we're able to do is bring that user, in, and let's go ahead, make some kind of a change right here. And now the user can hit save. And what we'll see is that let's leave, and now we'll come back, and you can see those changes stuck. So it gets to be pretty easy to put the user in edit mode, let the user make some changes, and then let the user save those changes back. And everything is being done as a service principal. Now, going one step further, if the user has edit permissions, they can save an existing report with customizations, but they can't create a new report. So let's go one more step here. And that is, let's go back to edit. Let's go back and click on create. And now that we have done that, you can see I've kind of created this to be demoware. So it's very easy for me just to kind of hit the refresh. And now when this user goes into edit mode, they're going to have a save and save as. So here's an example of, let's say that now, we add the filter pane, we take state, and now we want just the California sales. So now we'll come back here and we'll do a save as, and this will be sales. But so we give the user a very simple way to extend the reports by one, customizing existing reports, two, calling save as on an existing report, which is creation. And then also, if you have a data set down here, the application allows you to click on a data set and it creates a brand new report based on that data set, such that I can come through here and, let's say that we go ahead and add state and, something else inside here. So you see it gets to be fairly quick, to go through and to, build these type of things here. Okay. And which group are you in, Scott? I can't remember. Okay, just kidding. But now we'd be able to kind of take this, and notice with a new report, you can't save. It's never been saved before. And so we'll go ahead and we'll give this report a nice name. And what we want to see with this experience is that, once we've done the save, it just adds it, to the set of existing reports. So once again, when you're looking to kind of add self-service, that gets to be something where if you kind of use our starting point, we kind of have that type of behavior already built in. One thing to note is that when you're editing here, you're editing the report, not the data model. So we had some announcements, and there'll be continued announcements before the start of the summer, about a web editing experience. And that will first be available in the service, and then over time it will be available in Power BI embedding. But what I've showed you here kind of shows how we can allow the users to customize kind of the report level of what we are working with. Okay, let's see where we are, Scott. So we talked about managing these user permissions. And we talked about, how the back end is creating a view model, that has the embed token that dictates what reports that user can see and, what reports the user can, customize and save changes back to. And the embed token also specifies, whether the user can create new reports in a particular workspace. Just a bit, we'll talk a little bit more about embed tokens. But what I wanted to do is kind of go through that demo where we kind of started with the user being, unassigned, and just to see that, what is happening. It's just the web API is reading from a database and deciding what permissions that user has and building them, into the embed token, and then sending back other hints, for that user, experience inside there. And so, what I was able to kind of show is this UI. And then also I kind of stepped through the kind of the self-service, report authoring. Once we had that user have edit mode, they could edit, and then we could also go to create mode and, have things like, save as, and the ability to create new reports. Okay, now a couple more topics we want to get to. We've got about 5 minutes for each of these last 3 topics. Let's start with token management. That gets to be important. And so all the tokens, are being built, inside of the web API. If, you want to kind of go through this code right here, what you can see here is that if you go down to the web API, and then you go to the Power BI service API, this is kind of the code that we're going to look at right here. And in particular, we're going to drill down into get embed token. Now, when we look at this code right here, the idea of this algorithm, is that, we get past a user, and this is post authentication. So kind of the controller is the one that makes sure that the user is authenticated, and then we have the identifier for that user. So what this code is going to do is simply reach into our database, does this user exist? If the user is not assigned to a tenant, we're not going to do anything. If the user is assigned to a tenant, now a couple things, when you call set calling context, here's also kind of where we're shifting gears. At first, we would call in as a service principal, but earlier for this tenant, we created a service principal profile. And the way those are managed are through GUID identifiers. So this basically reaches into the database, for this tenant, finds the profile ID, and now we're going to build an embed token. But one of the things about embed tokens is that if you build one embed token that has all the report IDs and dataset IDs you need, then you don't need to continually make extra round trips to get security tokens. Now, there is a limit of 50 IDs, inside of an embed token, but for our case right here, we're going to have maybe 2 or 3 data sets and 10 reports, that's not going to be an issue. And the idea here is if I look down this code, I'd say that our API names are a little clunky. Generate token request v2 data set, so you basically have to get GUIDs for both the reports and the data sets and put them in there. Couple things to note, if you are using paginated reports that connect to a Power BI data set, you have to put XML permissions read-only. The second thing that can trip you up is that when you create the embed token and you add in a report, if you want the user to be able to edit that report, you have to put allow edit true. However, the gotcha here is that, in this example, I have both a regular report and a paginated report. So paginated reports don't support editing in the browser. So even if the user has edit mode, if you say allow edit equals true, and the embed token is for a paginated report, it will cause an error. So those are things that we found, as we go through. So in general, the embed token is going to have the report ID and dataset ID for everything you need. And then also, this is not all that intuitive. If you want to be able to create new reports, you then need the GUID of the workspace ID in the embed token. And once you have that, that's how you can do save as or create new. Okay, so that's how we create the embed tokens. Now, one little thing here, and let's see if I can demo this. So let's say that we have a report, and now we're going to do a save as. Once again, Scott's like, Ted, what is your fascination with Fiddler?
I love it, man. This is great.
Okay, so what's going to happen here is that, so now Mary, the report, we're going to go ahead and hit save. So what's going to happen is it's going to create this new report. And as it creates this new report, it creates a brand new GUID. So the problem is your embed token has to have the report ID of the new report, but it's not available until the report is created. So what we have here is something that, we have something where, we can get the embed token. And, the way that we're able to do that is just by making a call. And now it's going to get, all the report IDs in the current workspace. But what's a little bit tricky about this, is what happens, when you do a save as command. And the save as command then is going to initiate a callback to basically get a new embed token. So what will happen is someone will call save as. It will go to the back end. It will, save it on the back end, and then come back to the front end and execute your saved event. So that new report ID is then available. So we're going to call refresh embed token, to go back and get that data. Okay. One other thing you'll note about this is that we wanted to kind of show some examples of, if I come back, token expiration. Now, when you create an embed token, by default, it's going to be 60 minutes. There's also this issue, Scott, where when you get an embed token, you have to send an access token, and that access token has a lifetime. So when I get an access token and I create my first embed token, it's going to be 60 minutes. But if I then use the same access token 30 minutes later, that access token has a lifetime of 30 minutes, and I can't create an embed token whose lifetime is longer than the access token. So one of the things that you don't want to do is you don't want to let your Azure AD access token for the service principal get down to 2 minutes, because then you're going to get an embed token with a very little lifetime. But what we've kind of done here is kind of showed that, we can call refresh token and handle things behind the scenes. We see some financial companies that really hate the 60-minute time. They really want to push it down to 15 minutes or 10 minutes. So what we've done here is kind of showed where we're setting the embed token for 10 minutes, but we also have code so that when we get down to 2 minutes to go, it automatically calls and gets a new embed token. Now, I know some customers, this won't be good enough. When we kind of get down to 2 minutes, they'll probably bring up some kind of prompt saying, are you still there? Because we're not going to have, an ongoing thing where we just kind of keep refreshing it. But for some scenarios, refreshing the embed token automatically, especially I have a report, I just want to show it, in the lobby of our company when people walk in, I just want the embed token refreshed around the clock, and that's something, you can certainly do, with this particular strategy. Okay, 2 more things. Effective identity and RLS will be first. So with effective identity, the first thing I have to point out is that a lot of people, like row level security, get excited about working with low level security. But when you come to, Power BI and multi-tenant environments, that's not where you start. In fact, I would say that, using row level security in a multi-tenant environment is optional. Sometimes you need it, often you don't. Yeah, and the idea is that splitting the customer data out into separate data sets, provides the ability to isolate the data just by writing your queries, and doing filtering, at the Power Query level. So it's really only when you have different users, going to the exact same tenant, and we need varying levels of permissions between them, then adding, row level security in addition, to everything you've done with the embed token, could be something. I just kind of see people starting thinking row level security is their starting point, where generally it is not in a multi-tenant design. Now, just looking at some code here, if I want to work with row level security, what I need to do is inside of my embed token, I'm building this effective identity. And the things I can put in there is the username. I have to add the data sets, that are RLS enabled. Also note that if you try to embed a report and the underlying data set has RLS and you don't pass an effective identity, it will fail. Or if you pass an identity, to a data set that doesn't have RLS, it will fail. So you have to know, whether the data set supports RLS or not. Now, drilling down here, you can pass the username, which typically you'll have, from your authentication. There's also something which is custom data. And both user data or username and custom data can be used to pass data through the embed token, to RLS rules. We used to not have custom data in Power BI a year ago, so we just use username, but now we have custom data, so there are things that you can do by passing that, and we'll see one example coming up. And also note that an effective identity, you're going to pass a string array of roles. You have to pass one role, but it is possible to pass multiple roles. So here's an interesting design here. Let's say that, we have this get report function. And so let's kind of look over here, and I could do something saying, well, let's kind of create this RLS user data, and I'm going to put them in this role, and we're going to have, these states inside here. So there is a little bit of flexibility to kind of have multiple filtering values passed. But I also want to make the point that this can only go so far. Custom data today supports 256 characters. Okay. The semi-good news is we're going to boost that 4 times, up to 1024 in the short term. But it's still going to be way too short for someone that wants to put, 500 values of zip codes inside there. So those are the kind of designs we see that, that don't scale. And some of the issues that you have here is that when you write an RLS rule, here's something where we're going to do a string search. Okay, there's a lot of people I work with that are really good at optimization, and they have a rule: the only thing I will ever create with RLS is equality. This value equals that. Once you start doing things like string searches, you have to really look at the number of rows. And so what we see on the Power BI CAT team is just lots of customers coming, and they have RLS designs, which in theory are great, but in practice don't work because they're doing string searches, through a million rows. That just doesn't work. Here's something where if we factor the state out of the customers table and have a state table, well, now I can kind of reduce the rows that have to, go through the RS rule with a string search, down to 50 rows, instead of over, a 250,000. So once again, a lot of times people have grandiose ideas about passing lots of filter values, in the embed token, and then they end up having to kind of pass a single key in the embed token and do the filtering, over inside the data model. And we just kind of see that repeated because, in theory, before you understand the performance implications, you're thinking RLS is a great set of things that I can do.
Sounds like it's another one of those examples of just because you can doesn't mean you should.
That's correct.
But yeah, we've seen this in other situations where the RLS in theory is a pretty simple one, and then all of a sudden it starts permutating into all these exceptions, and you have to start managing the same rules across different data sets, and it's crazy it overwhelms the complexity. You start building up technical debt down the road. So yeah, so it's a great call out here to be careful with these.
And what my dad used to say about his Army experience: never enough time to do it right, always enough time to do it again. But what the pattern just happens to be, push a single ID over to the other side, and then it's a lot more work to get your data model right. But once you get it there, you're going to be in a much more performant state. Okay. Ted and Scott waxing poetic. Let's go into one more session here, and that is, adding a custom telemetry layer. So once again, the core problem we're trying to solve is, as people are using my reports, how can I monitor usage? Now you have the Power BI activity log, and that's great for monitoring people that are using reports in user owns data embedding or through the Power BI service. And there's a 15-minute lag, but you can see who's seen what. But you don't get the same ability with app owns data embedding. In fact, for privacy reasons, we don't want to put anything, about, your users, into the logs. So what you will see is that it will only tell you that the report was opened by a service principal, but not by which user. So what we're going to propose here is a custom telemetry layer. And, the idea here is, let's go back and, once again, we'll look at Fiddler here. And so now we will look at this report. And, as I see this report, I'll now kind of make a quick change. We'll hit save. And so what we're going to see here is that there is an activity log. And if I bring this down, you can kind of see that we're just sending events, from the browser, back to the back end so they can be, captured in a database. And what's kind of neat about this is that, let's say that this user, bring back the navigation menu here, and we'll go to, some different places, as you, do filtering. What's kind of nice is that when you use Power BI embedding, you have this set of events that you're able to capture. Page changed, visual clicked, filter applied. And so, what you're able to do is have events, handle all this, and send this kind of information to the back end. Now, just to kind of illustrate that, let's now go back to our admin application. And inside of our app, let's go and look at the activity log. And so what's kind of neat is that this is just being added to our database, in real time. And I can see, what users have opened the reports and things where this can go further than the Power BI activity logs is, what reports pages did they navigate to? What filter, did people apply the most? So as, users are doing different things to the report, you can capture different events and send the payload, of all the, event data into the back end. And, once again, if you're trying to kind of really see the usage or what pages are most popular or, which visuals are people interacting with the most, you're able to get that. The final thing I want to point out here is that we can also get render times. So inside of the Power BI client-side model, let me go one more page here. One of the things that you're able to do is when you embed a report, you can kind of start a stopwatch. And then you can say when the load event fires, capture the time, from the embedding start to the end of the load event and also to the rendered event. And what this can do is start to give you some type of, proactive way to monitor when report performance starts getting really bad. Quite often, we see people with a load event happens fine, but they put 30 or 40 visuals on a report, and that's why, it's taking, 20 seconds, to complete the rendering phase, because the rendering phase, finishes when the very last, visual on that page, has gotten its data. And, once again, having some type of a dashboard to monitor your environment, where you can proactively reach out to, customers who are exhibiting this kind of bad behavior and look into, how we might be able to, fix those errors. Okay, so where are we, Scott? We covered a lot of stuff today, but I think, if I review what are the common points, you got to start with a decision of user owns data or app owns data. You can't start planning and implementing code, until you've made that decision, because things are so drastically different. We walk through, a lot of the different guidance that we put into the, the app owns data starter kit, in terms of provisioning content, provisioning tenants, managing permissions, allowing self-service reporting, and then some other, important issues, token management, row level security, and, monitoring usage. So that's what we have today. We'll close up in just a second, but I also kind of wanted to point out, what's coming up next month. And we're going to have 1 hour dedicated to nothing but setting data source credentials with code. Do I do it as a user? Do I do it as a service principal? How do I do it, with PowerShell versus C#? What's the difference between, doing it, for Azure SQL, versus a data flow, versus Snowflake? And we just see a lot of questions. So, what we thought is one session where we kind of drill down, into as much detail as possible, would be good, as a resource. What do you think about all this, Scott?
That looks amazing, man. It's incredible the territory you covered so far, and I mean such a positive thing that there is so many options available. The challenge is sometimes taking advantage of the options or figuring out what it is, but at least you have a choice between different ways to approach a problem and the different types of problems that each customer is trying to solve. And I thank you for this really amazing stuff. I did put the links to your to the GitHub repo in the window and made an announcement about them. Put those links out there. I'm sure you'll add them to the show notes later. But this has been amazing, and I look forward to catching up on this next one coming up in April.
Yes, it's going to be very, very fun. Well, we'd like to thank everyone for attending it and everyone who decided to watch this after the fact. And we'd love you to keep coming back and joining us for Power BI Dev Camp. So thanks very much, everyone, for attending today.
Sounds great. Cheers, again. See you.